1 Corinthians 1:27. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. The church was nearly empty on the day of Naomi's wedding. A few pews were filled, mostly with elders from Pastor Elijah's small congregation and Naomi's mother, who had been praying fervently behind the scenes. But the seats where friends and extended family should have been sat, cold and silent. Most of them had refused to attend. Some said it was embarrassment, others said Naomi had lost her mind. A woman like that, marrying a man who can't afford electricity in his own house? The whispers echoed even louder than the church bells. Naomi had heard it all. How she could have had a doctor, a lawyer, or at least someone with a steady income. She was beautiful, educated, and came from a respected family, and yet she chose Elijah. A humble man with nothing to offer but prayer, vision, and a deep, unshakable faith in God. Naomi wasn't blind. She knew what people thought. But she had seen something in Elijah no one else cared to look for. A quiet strength, a genuine love for God, and a calling greater than any pay. As she stood before him that day, hand in hand, she whispered under her breath, "Lord, I trust you, even when they laugh." After the wedding, Naomi and Elijah returned to his modest apartment, a tiny 2-room flat behind the church building. The walls were thin, the furniture mismatched, and the kitchen barely big enough to turn around in. Still, Naomi moved with grace, unpacking their wedding gifts with a smile, humming as she stacked chipped plates into the cabinet. She wasn't fazed. She didn't marry for status, she married for calling. But, across town, her friends gathered for brunch and turned her decision into gossip. She threw her whole future away, one said, sipping orange juice. All that potential, just to end up barefoot and broke. Another added, she could have at least married someone struggling with a real career. Pastor or not, he's going nowhere. Their laughter was sharp, laced with disbelief. To them, Naomi's choice looked like desperation. But what they didn't see were the nights Elijah spent in prayer for the city, the quiet way he served the poor, or how he spoke to Naomi like she was God's most precious creation. Naomi heard about the whispers, but she held her peace. She knew God often began his greatest works in the most overlooked places. Naomi quickly adjusted to life as a pastor's wife, not because it was easy, but because she understood sacrifice. Each morning she rose early to sweep the small church, prepare breakfast for Elijah, and spend time in prayer before the town stirred. The offering basket was rarely full, but she still tithed from the little they had. Elijah spent his days visiting sick members, counseling broken marriages, and praying over children who came to church hungry. There was no applause, no recognition, just sweat, tears, and unwavering faith. One evening, Naomi knelt by the bedside, her voice low. "Lord, I know what I married into. I know this calling won't be glamorous, but you see us, you see Elijah's heart, you see our obedience. Let nothing be wasted, God." Elijah joined her, placing his hand gently over hers. "One day," he said softly, "this church will be full, not because of show, but because God's glory will draw them in." Naomi smiled through her tears. What they were building couldn't be measured in money or social approval. It was deeper. It was spiritual. And just like seeds planted in secret, their faith was beginning to take root underground, where no one else could see. Naomi hadn't seen her father since the wedding. A wealthy businessman with influence across the region, he had strongly opposed her decision to marry Elijah. He hadn't spoken to her in months, and had told relatives he no longer had a daughter. So when his car pulled up unexpectedly in front of the church one Saturday afternoon, Naomi's heart began to race. Elijah was inside preparing his Sunday sermon, while she was tending to the flowers by the gate. Her father stepped out, well-dressed as always, his face unreadable. He glanced at the peeling paint of the church, then at Naomi's simple dress and sandaled feet. "You look thinner," he said, not as a compliment. Naomi stood tall. "I'm also joyful and I have peace, Daddy." He shook his head, chuckling dryly. "You always did have a way of seeing gold in dirt." Before she could respond, Elijah stepped outside. Calm, respectful, he extended his hand. "Good afternoon, sir." Naomi's father didn't take it. "You're the reason my daughter is wasting her life in poverty." Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm just following the one who gave me mine." Naomi stood between them, her past and her future, knowing full well that honor wasn't given by titles or wealth, but by obedience. And obedience always bears fruit, even if it takes time to bloom. That night, heavy rains swept through the town, flooding roads and damaging several homes, including the tiny apartment behind the church. Water seeped through the cracked walls, soaking the floor and forcing Naomi and Elijah to sleep on the church pews. Naomi wrapped herself in a borrowed blanket and leaned her head on Elijah's shoulder, her body shivering not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. "This is the hardest it's been," she whispered. Elijah squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, but even storms pass. We just have to endure a little longer." The next morning, Naomi woke early to find Elijah praying alone at the altar. His voice was low but full of faith. "God, we've never asked for comfort, only for strength. Provide what we need, multiply the little, and if this is the fire, refine us in it." Naomi's eyes welled with tears. She had never seen a man love God more than comfort. Later that day, they found a kind church member willing to offer a small guest room for them to stay in temporarily. It wasn't fancy, but it was dry, warm, and safe. As they settled in, Naomi looked at Elijah and said softly, "They may never understand why I chose you, but I thank God every day that I did." They didn't know it yet, but that storm had only made their roots stronger, and soon those roots would push up something neither of them saw coming. The following Sunday, the congregation gathered in the small, worn church as they always did. Naomi prepared the hymns, Elijah straightened the pulpit, and the same faithful handful trickled in, mostly elderly women and a few restless children. Naomi had learned not to count numbers, but to value souls. She sang with all her heart, even when only 5 voices echoed back. But that morning, something unusual happened. As Naomi sang the closing hymn, the door creaked open and a tall stranger stepped inside. He was dressed modestly, but there was something striking about him, something that made everyone glance twice. He sat quietly in the back, listening intently as Elijah preached a simple but powerful message about enduring seasons of small beginnings. After service, while the members trickled out, the man approached Elijah and Naomi. "May I have a moment?" he asked politely. Elijah smiled. Of course. The man introduced himself as Mr. Lawrence, a regional manager for a large Christian charity organization. He explained that he had been visiting small churches in hidden towns, looking for ministries that had the heart of service, not just the appearance of it. And what he had witnessed today touched him deeply. "There's something special here," Mr. Lawrence said, shaking Elijah's hand. "And I believe God led me here for a reason." Naomi and Elijah exchanged a glance. They didn't know it yet, but the seeds they had sown in secret were about to sprout publicly. Later that week, Mr. Lawrence returned to the church, this time with a team and a file folder in his hands. Naomi offered them water as Elijah sat down with cautious curiosity. The team explained that they had been following the impact of small churches around the country, and out of dozens visited, this one had stood out not because of its size, but because of its spirit. Mr. Lawrence opened the folder and placed a neatly bound proposal on the wooden table. It was a full-scale renovation and outreach support plan, funded entirely by the charity. "We want to rebuild this church, supply it with equipment, and support a food program for the surrounding community," he explained. Elijah blinked slowly, barely processing the words. Naomi covered her mouth with trembling hands. For years, they had labored without applause, without resources, with only faith holding them together. And now, out of nowhere, God was showing them that he had seen it all. Before leaving, Mr. Lawrence looked at them and said, "God doesn't overlook sacrifice. He multiplies it." Naomi and Elijah stood silently after the team left, holding the proposal in their hands. Tears slipped down Naomi's cheeks as she leaned into Elijah's shoulder. God had remembered them. And it wasn't just a blessing. It was a sign that the mocking, the struggle, the prayers, the tears, it had all mattered. By the following Sunday, word had started to spread. Photos of the renovation trucks parked outside the little church appeared on social media, sparking surprise and quiet murmurs across town. People who had once mocked Naomi's choice began sending her cautious messages. Some were curious. Some pretended they had always believed in her, and others simply said, "I heard about the church. God is really doing something." Naomi read each message with calm, never boasting, only quietly acknowledging what she knew all along. God had been working in the shadows. As the walls were torn down and rebuilt, as new instruments were delivered and the roof was repaired, people began to stop by. Some said they were just passing through, but Naomi knew better. They were watching. The same people who once laughed at her wedding, the same ones who whispered about her sleeping on pews, were now witnessing something they could not explain. Elijah didn't preach louder or change his message. He remained the same humble man with the same gentle voice. But now, when he stood at the pulpit, the chairs were fuller. The air felt heavier with purpose. God wasn't just restoring their physical building, he was rebuilding their reputation, and every stone laid was a reminder that obedience always echoes louder than opinion. The newly painted walls gleamed under the afternoon sun as Naomi arranged chairs for a midweek women's meeting. She wore a soft blue dress and had a peaceful smile as she worked, unaware of the car pulling into the lot. It was the same sleek car her father drove, the same one that had left her standing in silence months ago. He stepped out slowly, looking around with an expression that was no longer hardened but humbled. She met him at the door. There was no tension in her eyes, only a calm strength he hadn't seen before. He looked around at the building, now vibrant and alive with activity. His voice cracked slightly as he said, "I was wrong. I didn't see what you saw in this man, in this life. But now I do. You chose purpose. You chose faith. You chose well." Naomi's eyes glistened as she took a slow breath. "I chose God," she said simply, "and he never fails." Her father nodded, visibly moved. He didn't ask for forgiveness directly, but his presence, his softened tone, and his willingness to return were enough for her. As he sat through that day's Bible study, surrounded by women who once looked at her with pity, Naomi felt something shift. God wasn't just redeeming her name. He was restoring broken relationships. He was making everything beautiful, in his time. It was a quiet Saturday when Naomi bumped into Cassandra at the local market. Cassandra had once been the loudest voice in the room, the one who laughed the hardest when Naomi married Elijah. She was dressed in expensive clothes as always, but her eyes looked tired, worn by something that money couldn't fix. Naomi greeted her warmly, as if the past had no grip on her spirit. Cassandra hesitated before responding, as if unsure whether she was still allowed to stand in Naomi's presence. "I saw everything online," Cassandra finally said. "The church, the outreach, the lives being changed. I didn't expect it." Naomi smiled, calm and radiant. "Neither did we, but God knew." Cassandra looked down at her shopping basket, then back at Naomi. "I judged what I didn't understand. I thought you were settling. I didn't know you were sowing." Naomi nodded slowly, her voice soft but steady. "Most people don't see the value in a seed until it starts growing." They parted ways, but Cassandra walked away changed. Not just by Naomi's words, but by her humility. Naomi didn't seek revenge or vindication. She extended grace. That was the difference. And as Naomi returned home with her groceries, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for how far they had come, but for the strength to never return bitterness for bitterness, because grace speaks louder than pride, and love planted in faith always bears fruit. Sunday service overflowed with people, so much so that chairs had to be set up outside. Families came not just from town but neighbouring communities. Some had heard testimonies, others came out of curiosity. Elijah preached the same way he always had, gentle, sincere, rooted in Scripture. But something had shifted. His words pierced deeper now, not because they were louder, but because they carried the weight of lived obedience. And Naomi, standing beside him as he prayed over new believers, felt the awe of God's hand resting upon everything they once cried over. After service, a young couple approached them in tears. They said they had come to mock, but something in the message broke them. The woman sobbed as she said, "We judged what we didn't know, but now we want what you have. Real peace, real love, real purpose." Naomi hugged her tightly, and Elijah laid hands on them both as the congregation prayed. It was happening. Hearts were changing, lives were being restored, not by gimmicks or grandeur, but by the quiet force of God's presence. Naomi later stood by the altar, her hands clasped, whispering to herself, This is what they couldn't see when they laughed. This is what only God could do. The promise was unfolding, not in pride, but in power. The story of the small-town church that rose from broken walls to transforming lives began to spread beyond their region. One afternoon, a media van pulled up outside the church. 2 journalists stepped out, smiling politely and holding cameras. "We've been hearing about what's happening here," one of them explained. "The growth, the healing testimonies, the transformation. It's inspiring. We'd love to do a feature." Elijah hesitated, as he always did when attention came. He had never sought it, but Naomi gently touched his arm and nodded. Sometimes, testimonies weren't meant to be hidden. Sometimes, they were meant to light the way for others. The journalists spent the afternoon filming the building, the outreach kitchen, and even interviewing some of the members. Naomi shared part of their journey, not to boast, but to glorify God. "I didn't marry potential," she said. "I married purpose, and purpose always bears fruit in its time." The video was released the following week, and within days it went viral across Christian platforms. More support poured in, more churches reached out. But Naomi and Elijah remained grounded. They didn't chase the spotlight. They just stayed faithful, and in doing so the light found them. One quiet morning, Naomi was sorting through the growing pile of church mail when she came across an envelope with international postage. Curious, she opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter from a woman named Margaret in the United Kingdom. She had seen the viral video and written to say how deeply the story touched her. "I was on the verge of walking away from my faith," Margaret wrote, "but your journey reminded me that God still moves in small places through quiet obedience." Naomi sat down, overwhelmed. The letter wasn't just encouraging, it was confirmation. God had taken their humble story and placed it in the hands of someone oceans away who needed hope. As Elijah entered the room, Naomi handed him the letter, her eyes full of tears. "This is why we endured. Not for praise, not for recognition, but so someone like Margaret could believe again." That evening, Naomi knelt at the same altar where they once prayed for groceries. She whispered words of gratitude, not for the fame, but for the fruit. The harvest was real, and it stretched far beyond what she ever imagined. It was then she realized. Obedience had a ripple effect, and when God writes your story, it never ends with just you. It flows into others, reviving hearts, restoring faith, and silencing every laugh of doubt along the way. One evening, as Naomi was preparing notes for the women's group, she received an email from a National Christian Women's Conference. The subject line read, "Invitation to share your story." At first, she thought it was a mistake, but as she read through the message, she realized it was real. The organizers had seen the viral video and wanted her to be a keynote speaker, to share her journey of faith, sacrifice, and divine restoration. Her hands trembled as she held her phone. She had never spoken before a large crowd. She wasn't a preacher or a public figure, but something inside her whispered, "This is not about you. It's about what I've done through you." She showed the message to Elijah, who looked at her with quiet pride. "This is your harvest, Naomi. Walk into it boldly." The day of the conference arrived, and Naomi stood on a stage before hundreds of women from across the country. As she spoke about marrying a man with nothing, about trusting God in the dark, about being mocked and overlooked, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. She ended her talk with the same truth she carried from day one. God doesn't bless noise, He blesses obedience. And what people laugh at today, they'll stand in awe of tomorrow. After the conference, Naomi returned home to find a bouquet of wildflowers and a small note on the kitchen table. It was from Elijah. It read simply, "I'm proud of you. Thank you for believing in what no one else saw." Naomi pressed the note to her chest, overwhelmed by how far they had come. From empty pews and leaky roofs to stages and transformed lives. A few days later, a woman knocked at the church office door. Naomi recognized her immediately. Sister Angela, one of the older women who had once discouraged her from marrying Elijah. She had been vocal about her doubts and often warned others not to follow Naomi's footsteps. But today, she looked different. Humble, gentle, tearful. She sat down across from Naomi and took her hand. "I came to repent," she said quietly. "I misjudged you. I misjudged what God can do. You've taught me more through your obedience than any sermon I've heard." Naomi didn't say much. She just held her hand tightly, her heart swelling with peace. It wasn't about being right. It was about letting God speak for you in His time. That afternoon, Naomi knelt at the altar again. She whispered, "You're making all things new." And deep inside she knew they were only halfway through what God was about to unfold. It was a quiet morning when Elijah returned from a ministry trip with an envelope in his hand. Naomi was setting the table for breakfast when he handed it to her, his expression unreadable. She opened it slowly and found a letter inside, along with a certified bank draft. Her eyes widened as she scanned the page. It was a personal donation from a philanthropist who had watched their story online. No application, no request, just a note that said, "God told me to sow into your ministry, use it to expand the vision." Naomi sat down, stunned. The amount was enough to buy land, build a bigger facility, and support multiple outreach programs for years. Elijah placed his hand over hers, his voice steady. "We never asked anyone for this, but God saw." Naomi looked around the modest room they had once shared as newlyweds, where they had fasted, wept, and declared God's promises over empty cupboards. Now that same God had sent provision that neither of them had imagined. They didn't rush into spending. They prayed, fasted, and consulted wise counsel. Every step mattered. They knew this wasn't just a financial blessing, it was a divine trust. That day, Naomi wrote in her journal, "What began in lack has become a legacy. We didn't chase money, we chased God, and He brought everything else in time." The laughter of others had faded into silence. Now all they could hear was the sound of glory unfolding, quiet, steady, With wisdom and prayer, Naomi and Elijah began the next phase of their journey, purchasing land for a larger church and community center. They didn't choose the most glamorous location, but they chose the one God led them to. It was a wide, empty plot on the edge of town, ignored for years, overgrown and overlooked. Just like them. Elijah walked the land slowly, hands lifted toward the sky. "Lord, if you're in it, we'll build it. If you're not, we'll wait." Within weeks, volunteers from near and far came to help. Some were builders, others were skilled laborers, and many were simply people who believed in the story. Naomi helped design a community outreach center alongside the sanctuary, complete with classrooms, a food pantry, and a wellness room for women. It wasn't just a church. It was a house of healing. As the foundation was poured, Naomi stood beside Elijah and whispered, "This is more than we dreamed." Elijah nodded, his eyes damp. "It's what God dreamed through us." When neighbors passed by and asked what was being built, the answer came with gentle pride. A church. A place where forgotten people are remembered. A place where broken things are made whole. And slowly, the very town that once mocked them began to marvel. The new building was nearly finished when Naomi received another unexpected message, this time from a national pastors' network. They were holding a leadership summit and wanted to honor Elijah for his ministry's impact. For years, his name had never been listed among the greats. He wasn't invited to big pulpits or conferences. He was just the quiet preacher in the corner, shepherding a few faithful souls. But now, God was calling him to the table that once ignored him. Elijah was hesitant. "I'm not one for titles," he told Naomi as he read the invitation, but she smiled, taking his hand. "You didn't labor for this. You labored for God. This is His doing, not yours." The day of the summit, Elijah stood among men with prestige and power, but when he shared his story of poverty, ridicule, unwavering faith, and Naomi's sacrifices, the room fell silent. Not because of eloquence, but because of anointing. One of the senior leaders approached him afterward and said, "Your story reminded me what ministry is truly about. It's not the crowd, it's the cross. And you've carried it well." That night, Naomi and Elijah returned home with no award in hand, just peace in their hearts. Recognition had never been the goal, but when God decides it's your time, He doesn't just elevate you, He uses you to remind others what faith really looks like. On the dedication day of the new church building, the atmosphere was electric. Families gathered, children danced, and testimonies flowed like rivers of joy. Naomi walked through the hallways she had once only seen in prayer, touching the walls, breathing in the reality of a promise fulfilled. As Elijah prepared to take the pulpit, Naomi scanned the crowd and noticed an older woman sitting alone in the back row. She looked familiar. After the service, Naomi made her way to the woman and her breath caught. It was one of her former mentors, an elder from her youth, the same woman who had once warned her sternly against marrying Elijah. She had said Naomi's life would be ruined by a poor man with no prospects, yet here she sat, quiet and tearful. "I watched everything from afar," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I was wrong. I judged too quickly. I forgot how God moves." Naomi didn't respond with pride or pointed words. She simply knelt beside her, gently took her hand, and said, "It was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about staying faithful to what God said, even when no one else saw it." The woman wept in her arms, and others who witnessed it felt the weight of what was happening. Reconciliation, redemption, restoration. It wasn't just bricks and chairs that had been rebuilt. It was hearts. And Naomi, once ridiculed, now stood as a living testimony that when God's hand is on your life, He will make even your doubters bow, not to you, but to His glory working through you. As the months passed, the new church building became more than just a place of worship. It became a refuge. The outreach center served hot meals to the hungry twice a week. A classroom upstairs offered free tutoring to children from struggling homes. Naomi hosted wellness sessions for women, teaching them about prayer, purpose, and self-worth. People who had never set foot in a church before were now walking through those doors, not because of eloquent preaching, but because love lived there. One afternoon, Naomi stood by the window watching a little girl skip toward the door with a bowl of food in her hand. That child reminded her of why they started, why they endured, why they kept going even when there was nothing but faith in their hands. Elijah came and wrapped an arm around her shoulder. "Do you remember when we had nothing but candles and cracked walls?" Naomi smiled. "And now we have a building, a people, and a vision, but most of all, we still have Him." They walked through the hallways together, not as two people who had arrived, but as two servants still trusting God, one step at a time. Every miracle, every life changed was a piece of the story He was still writing. The church wasn't a monument to success, it was a living altar. A reminder that sometimes God allows people to laugh at your beginning, so He can show them His glory at your becoming. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Naomi sat at her desk, reflecting on everything they had been through. The old journal she used to write in during the early days of her marriage still sat on the top shelf. She pulled it down and flipped through the pages. Prayers, scribbled in desperation, tear-stained declarations of faith, and dreams too big for their tiny apartment. She smiled, then reached for a blank page and began to write. Not to God this time, but to the girl she used to be. "Dear Naomi, you were right to choose faith. They called you foolish, but heaven called you faithful. They laughed when you stood beside a man with empty pockets but a full heart. You cried in silence, but God was listening. You served in obscurity, but God was watching. And now you live in the evidence of every prayer you thought he didn't hear." She paused, tears running down her cheeks. Then she wrote the last line. "You thought you married a poor man, but you really married a promise. And today that promise is still unfolding." She closed the journal and placed it gently on the shelf. There was no bitterness in her heart, no desire to boast, only gratitude. God had done more than she ever asked, and she had become more than she ever imagined. Naomi was in the middle of organizing donations for the outreach pantry when Elijah walked in with a stunned look on his face. She looked up, concerned. "What is it?" Elijah held up his phone. "The mayor just called. He wants to recognize the church for its service to the city." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't pride that filled the room. It was reverence. Reverence for a God who takes the overlooked and places them before kings. A week later, they stood on a small stage at City Hall, receiving a certificate of honor. The mayor, a man they had never met personally, spoke into the microphone. "This church has not only served its congregation, but has become a pillar of light in this community. We salute the sacrifice, humility, and unwavering love that has flowed from these walls." Applause filled the room, but Naomi barely heard it. She was remembering the nights they ate rice and salt, the time they patched a roof with plastic sheets, the wedding day people skipped because they didn't believe in her choice. And now, the same city that once questioned her was applauding. That night, as they returned to their home, Elijah turned to her and said, "Still want to trade your wedding for a fancier one?" Naomi laughed softly and shook her head. This was the wedding gift I didn't know I was waiting for. Not the certificate, not the applause, but knowing that obedience led us exactly where God wanted us all along. One sunny afternoon, as Naomi was leaving the church after a women's seminar, she noticed a young woman sitting alone near the gate. Her head was bowed, her eyes red from crying. Naomi approached gently and sat beside her without saying a word. After a few moments of silence, the girl spoke softly. "They say I'm crazy for wanting to marry a man who has nothing but a vision. Everyone thinks I'm throwing my life away." Naomi's heart stirred. She turned toward the girl and said, "Do you want to know a secret? I married a man with nothing too. No wealth, no status, only prayer and purpose. And they laughed at me." The girl looked up, eyes wide. "But now, look at what you both have." Naomi smiled. "What we have didn't come overnight. It came through tears, through choosing obedience over applause and trusting God even when it hurt. It came by planting seeds in private that only God could water." The girl reached for her hand. "Thank you for not hiding your story." Naomi squeezed it gently. "Never be afraid to follow God's voice, even when it makes you look foolish, especially when it makes you look foolish. That's usually where the miracle begins." As they sat together, the church bell rang softly in the distance. Naomi felt it again. The quiet joy of watching God recycle her pain into someone else's courage. Her story wasn't just her own anymore. It had become a lighthouse for others navigating storms. The church anniversary arrived, a full 5 years since Naomi had stood in a nearly empty chapel and vowed her life to a man mocked by many but chosen by God. The new sanctuary was filled with people whose lives had been changed, addicts now sober, marriages restored, children sponsored through school, widows fed and souls saved. Naomi walked slowly down the aisle, taking in every face, every testimony, every miracle standing in human form. Elijah stood at the pulpit, his Bible in hand, his voice steady and kind as always. But today, he didn't preach a sermon. Instead, he called Naomi forward and turned to the congregation. "Many of you know the ministry, but let me introduce you to the ministry behind the ministry. This woman, who stood beside me when I had nothing but a calling, who prayed when no one else believed, who carried the burden when no one else saw." The church rose to its feet in thunderous applause. Naomi stood there, tears spilling, her hands over her heart. She hadn't done it for this moment, but it humbled her deeply to witness the fruit of what had once been hidden sacrifice. Later that night, after the celebrations faded and the halls were quiet again, Naomi sat in the front pew alone, her hands folded, her heart full. Lord, thank you. Thank you for making beauty from ashes. Thank you for letting the laughs of others become the backdrop for your glory. She looked up at the cross above the altar and smiled. You did it, Lord, and you did it your way. Years had passed, but the memory of their beginning never faded from Naomi's heart. She and Elijah now led a thriving ministry that reached far beyond their town. Lives were being transformed daily, not just in the sanctuary, but through outreach, mentorship, and global partnerships. But even with all the growth, Naomi never lost her wonder. Not a day went by that she didn't remember the nights they had cried in each other's arms, trusting God in silence while others laughed. One evening, after a revival service, Naomi stood outside, gazing up at the night sky. Elijah joined her, and they held hands in silence. They didn't speak of their achievements. They simply marveled at God's grace. He had done it all. The fruit, the favor, the fullness. It all flowed from a simple yes. As they walked back into the church arm in arm, Naomi whispered under her breath, "We didn't build this, Elijah. God did. And he built it from nothing. From two hearts that simply chose to obey. The story that began in mockery ended in majesty. Not for fame, not for recognition, but so that every eye who once doubted could see that obedience to God is never wasted. And when he writes your story, even laughter turns to silence in awe of his glory." Isaiah 60:15. "Whereas you have been forsaken and hated, so that no one went through you, I will make you an eternal excellence, a joy of many generations." If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us create Christian faith stories like this. Thank you, and God bless you.